Hello Reddit. Today I'd like to discuss doing upvote downvote gifs using After Effects. For this I'm going to be using Adobe After Effects CS 5.5. Any version released recently I'm sure would be just as fine. I'm going to try to explain every aspect and angle of what I do, and hopefully you can pick up some information and start making your own upvote and downvote gifs. So for the example here, I'm going to go ahead and use the Gumby GIF that I'm sure a lot of people have seen. So I've gone ahead and opened up After Effects here, and we're in a untitled blank project. In the top left corner here, you're going to see we're in the project menu window here. So I'm going to right click in this area and I'm going to say import and import file. From the desktop I'm going to choose Gumby. Okay. Now at this point, this is basically our resources that we're going to be working with. But we need to get this down into a composition. So I can drag Gumby.gif down to here, which is going to be make new composition, and you can see in the bottom here this is going to show our current composition, which is listed in this bar right here next to render queue. And these are all the objects that we've added into this composition. In this case we've only added a single GIF, and that's why that's all we see right here. So we can go ahead and scrub through the animation here. And I'm sure we've all seen this one before, and we're going to basically turn this into an upvote and downvote GIF. We can also hit spacebar, and this will run through and do a preview. And this green bar that you see that loads here is basically rendering the scene. So the first time you run it through, it may be a little slow, but once you get a single pass through and it's all green, then when you run it through, it should play back smoothly. So if you're trying to do some stuff with motion blur or any type of animation that requires a lot of calculations, you might want to make sure this is run through once before you start judging on how well your animation looks. Okay, so we need to now go ahead and bring in our arrows. So I'm going to go import file again, and I'm going to go to my arrows folder, and I'm just going to use these basic ones. Okay, so I've got a pair of PNGs here, one for up and one for down, and I can just go ahead and drag these into my working area. You can see now that it's going to put that arrow or that object down into this new area down here. So we've got the two objects here. The first column that you'll see over here is the visibility column. So at any point in time, if we need to hide what we're working on, we can hide these objects by clicking the little eyeball here. We can also use this lock layer option, and when I use this, it basically doesn't let me adjust or modify anything to do with that row. If I try to click in here, you can see it's not going to let me edit it. So these are two useful tools in case you want to see what's behind your object, or you don't want to accidentally modify it. So we can go ahead and lock those or hide those. We can also rename this layer, and this is just to make it a little bit easier for yourself when you start adding a whole bunch of arrows. In some cases I'd like to name them arrow 1, arrow 2, anything to make it a little bit more easy for you to recognize what objects it is that you're working with down here. And we can also click on this column, which is going to switch between the source file name and our layer name. So if you accidentally click here and you notice all of a sudden nothing is what you named it, you can just simply click this column again. Okay, and that's pretty much the basics of putting objects down into the bottom area here. Now for this GIF, we're going to want to have the basketball that he's using be an upvote arrow that he's going to throw towards Gumby, and then when Gumby hits it, it's going to turn into a downvote arrow. So we basically want to follow where his hands are with the basketball up into the point to where Gumby hits it. So I'm going to start in the first frame there, and I'm going to go ahead and lock down my footage. That way I can only modify my arrow. Okay, and we're going to bring it over here onto where his hands are. Now the arrow is a little big in this case, so we want to adjust the size. Now when you hit the little arrow here, it's going to give us all the options that we can modify and put into keyframes for this object. So by default it's going to have transform, which when we open it up, the ones that we're going to ever want to deal with are position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Now if you've ever worked with Photoshop or Flash or any other type of tool that uses keyframing, After Effects works the same way. And what that basically does is in the time frame here, I can lay down keyframes and the program will automatically animate between the keyframes. So in this instance for position, you can see if I grab this first number here and scale left and right, you can see the object moving on the screen in the X position. This is the Y position. And if I grab it, you can see both numbers moving down there. So this number is going to equate to the location or position of the object on the screen. Now if I want to go ahead and lay down a keyframe at this spot, I first have to click the stopwatch, and this is going to put down a keyframe we can see right here, this little orange object. If I travel say 10 frames, and you can see we've got the time counter showing up right here, and then these are all your frames, these 5 frames, 10, and so on. Using page up and page down, you can also scrub through your frames, so it's kind of nice if you want to do some keyboard shortcuts. So we'll go ahead and go to 10 seconds, and I'm going to move, or I'm sorry, 10 frames, and I'm going to move this over to here. And when I let go, it's going to go ahead and automatically keyframe this because it recognized the difference between my original position and the new position. Now since these keyframes are standard and I don't have anything else in between, you can see when I move between this, the auto keyframing that we don't see is going to occur in the background. Now there aren't really keyframes, it's actually doing like a motion tween. So this is how we can get some easy animation to occur by just simply putting down 2 frames. If I go in the middle and say move it up here, you can see it's going to translate the location difference between those keyframes. So this is how we're going to be able to have this arrow move on the screen for us. Now in most cases when you're doing upvote downvote GIFs, the frame rate of the GIF you're working on is a little bit slower, and things are a little bit more jerky, so I don't necessarily use the transition between keyframes that much. I actually edit every single frame by hand because you're going to get much better results that way. Now you don't have to do it that way. You could get in situations where something's moving pretty consistently and you can use spaced out keyframes, but if you want to be the most accurate, you're going to have to edit each keyframe one at a time. So let's go ahead and if we highlight this, you can see we can highlight any amount that we want. I'm going to choose this one. I can also just click on it with left click and hit delete. That'll go ahead and get rid of that keyframe. Another thing too, let me add some more keyframes back here. You can see on the far left here there's actually a navigation that'll let us go in between the keyframes. So if you'd like to travel to just the keyframes that you've laid down, you can use this. You can also click on the middle object here and it'll actually remove that keyframe or add it. So that's another way to edit these keyframes. Okay, so in this case we want to make this arrow look appropriate in size. So first off, you can see this is a little bit small what I'm working with. At 100%, here's our magnification. This GIF is obviously pretty small, and we can tell what size we're working in for our composition. So remember, this whole area down here is a composition, and it's actually named Gumby, which was automatic. These are actually the objects that we've added, and this is the composition. You can even see right here it says type composition. So I can either come up here to composition and go to composition settings, or I can right click on Gumby and say composition settings, and this is going to show the height and the width, the frame rate, all the starting time and duration. If you just are using a GIF or a video file or anything, when you drag this down to this icon when we created the composition earlier, it automatically set all of this per the sizing of the file we were originally working with. So this Gumby GIF was actually 469 by 264 to begin with, so we automatically got our dimensions here. So if for any reason you need to adjust your dimensions, you can go ahead and do that on this screen, and that's for your composition as a whole. But in this case we just want to leave them at that, especially for the frame rate. You mostly don't have to work with this type of stuff. There's some cases you might want to adjust the frame rate, but a lot of times the GIFs are going to be anywhere between 10 to 20 movie files. If you've got an MP4, maybe 29 or 25, 24, just depending on what you're working with. So that's our composition settings. And like I said, since we're kind of small here and we want to look at what we're doing, we can either use the scroll wheel on the mouse, or you can click this drop down and choose a few options here. If we say fit up to 100%, that's going to try to make this as large as it can up until 100%. So if you're working with a very large source file, this will fill the entire viewport up to 100%. Now if I say fit, this is going to fill up the viewport as high as it can go until it's filled. In this case 182%. So that way you can make sure that you're seeing everything in your window. We'll go ahead and put it on this, that way we can get a good idea of what we're working with here. So in this case, first off, I do want to get rid of these keyframes, and if you use home and end, that'll let you go back and forth between the beginning and the end of your composition. Another thing you can do too is if you use B as in Brian or N as in Nancy, you actually set what's called the work area. Now if I hit spacebar, it's going to go ahead and render that, and the work area is kind of just a small section on where you're working. So if you have a very large GIF that you need it to render, that way you can see some of your other properties such as motion blurring and any other things you've added, you can adjust your work area so that you only render a small section instead of having to render the whole thing over and over. And it's kind of nice if you want to check out a certain animation that you've done or something, you can let it work between the work area. So if you double click on that, it'll go ahead and go back to the entire time frame. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this arrow on top of the basketball, and we can check that by toggling the visibility. Okay, so this arrow is a little bit large for the size that I really want. Of course, this is up to the editor, but to me it looks a little large. So one of the other properties that we can work with here is scale. Now with the scale, it's pretty much what it is, just the scale of the item, so I can pan this left and right and it'll change the size. So in this case, we'll probably take it down to about 65%. It looks pretty good to me. Another thing I find very useful, which can become a little disorienting, but is to disable these view controls here. So you can see right now we've got this box around here denoting where the object extends to. If you hit Control, Shift, and H as in Harry, it'll go ahead and get rid of that. Now why I like doing that is because you can see when I move this around now, I don't have those bounding boxes in my way. And later on, when you start getting into a lot of frames and using masking or anything like that, it becomes very useful to go ahead and hide that stuff so you can get some good fine details on what you're doing, because it gets a little confusing when you're trying to see what you're doing with those boxes in the way. So that's a good little thing I like to do. I'll kind of toggle back and forth depending on what I'm doing. So we'll go ahead and go with 65%. Now in this case, the ball is going to be going away from us, but it's such a short distance, I'm not even going to bother with the scale. In a lot of cases, if I'm moving from here towards the door and I want to make it look like it's actually going towards the door, let me go ahead and move it here so we've got this animation. I'll do the same thing. I'm going to start a keyframe on scale at 65%. I'm going to go all the way to the end here, and I'm going to say 40%. So now we've got that tweening going on. So I'm going to hide this, and you can see it's getting smaller. Let's actually make it really pronounced. Right, so it actually looks like it's going from his hand to the door. And of course this is just in a 2D space. We're only moving from right to left. But because we change the sizing, we kind of get that depth of field. And this is important if you really want to make your GIFs look reasonable and acceptable in terms of depth of field. Like I said, in this case though, it's not that important because it's very close, but in a lot of cases you would want to adjust your scale as you go. Now what I do though is I kind of do it in a process. The first thing I'm going to do is just the location or position of my object, and then later I'll come in, I'll do my scaling, and then I'll do my rotation and whatnot. And I find that works pretty well to kind of do it, you know, in a series of layers or whatever you want to call it. But one thing at a time, I think, makes the process go much smoother. So in this case, we want to follow the ball for each frame. Okay, so let's start out here. Like I said, I normally modify one frame at a time. Like I said, you can do, if you like, a couple at a time and let it do its own animation in between, but to get more accurate, I like doing one frame at a time. So I'm going to get really close in on this. So let's zoom in a little bit more. Now when you're in this view here, if you hold the spacebar down, you get a little hand here, and now you can left click and move around. Now make sure you hold spacebar, because if I were to just start dragging right now, which it won't do it because I'm locked, but it would actually drag around my footage here, which I don't want to do. So make sure you hold spacebar, and then you can move this around. So let's go ahead and start doing some modifications here. Okay, so you can see it kind of comes down a little bit, so let's move it down. And now you can see I'm already kind of getting some lines here, which those will start to add up over time, so I might want to get rid of that, which I'm going to do. I'm going to hide that. Okay, so you can see now as I scrub through this with page up, page down. Now you see how that kind of jumps there? That's because this position is different than this position, and what it's trying to do is it's trying to go in between those two positions. But in this gifs case, these two frames there's no difference. There's no difference in time. You can see the video doesn't move, but this is moving, and that obviously isn't correct. So what you can do is, right now this is a standard keyframe. These all look like standard keyframes. If I right click on this and I say toggle hold keyframe, what that does is, if I come in here and look at the keyframe velocity, the outgoing velocity has been set to 0. So if we look at, say, another one's keyframe velocity, you can see it's got bunch of numbers here. I really don't know exactly what these mean, but these have to do with the tweening animation that you're going to see. So by turning that off, what happens now is it doesn't do anything until it gets to a next keyframe. So you can see that the position from here to here is different, but it's not going to try to do any type of animation because I just did the toggle keyframe. So that's a good thing that you want to do if you do have a lot of spacing here and your GIF isn't moving at all. You'll end up getting this weird movement of your object, and so you're going to want to toggle hold keyframe. And I actually use that for a few other things, such as opacity. You know, if I'm at 100% here and I move, say, 10 frames or whatever, and then put it at 0, it's going to try to fade that out. Now I might not want that, so in this case I'm going to toggle this, hold keyframe on this one, which is going to keep it at 100% because it's got no outgoing velocity until it hits the next keyframe where there's a change, and now it's 0. And that's a way to get a quick hide instead of the gradual. And we'll be using that later on when we do a switch over to a downvote. So let me go ahead and continue on here, and you can see it's kind of doing it again here. So we'll toggle hold keyframe, and I'm not going to do the best job here since I'm doing a video, but more time you spend on it to make it a little bit nicer, it comes out a little bit better, and people are happy. Okay, so move down a little bit more. Let's get the ball in front of him. Say we don't want that again, so okay, so it gets a little hard sometimes when you got some grainy footage to work with here. You kind of want to play with the visibility to see what's going on. Okay, so he's got the ball about up here, and come a little higher, up to there. Like I said, I'm just doing this really quick. You don't want to take your time to put all this stuff in the right position. Okay. Now he's throwing it. Spacebar down. Let's move up a little bit. Toggle that guy again. Okay, so he threw it, and so it's off his hand, so we'll just put it just out of frame. Okay, so it's out of frame now. So For this one, I'll go ahead and just put it out into the open area here. You can see here's our motion path that the arrow is taken. And this is why I do like hiding this stuff, because it just gets in the way, I think. So go ahead and hide that. And so we get to this frame, it's out of camera footage. Go ahead a few frames and there it comes back in. So the previous frame right before it, I'm going to go ahead and get it close, and I'll tell you why later. There is some nice built-in motion blur that we're going to use, and motion blur works with the distance and position changes. So when we're coming off screen like this, we want to put it in a place that we're going to get the best type of motion blur, and I'll go over that in a little bit. Okay, so he's kind of coming back. Now he's right here. And this is probably our last frame. Okay, so he just got hit, right? So he's hitting the ball. Okay, so that means on this frame, the upvote no longer exists. So I want 0 opacity, and I'm going to start my keyframe mode. Remember, don't click this every time you want to lay down a keyframe. That's what this button's for. But you have to have this on to be in keyframe mode. If I were to click this button right now, it would wipe out all my keyframes, because it would basically turn off keyframing. So make sure you only click that if you're not in keyframing mode. And so right now, since I'm at 0% opacity, you can't see anything. So I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning and drop down 100%. Remember, since there's a change, then we're going to get an automatic keyframe here. And we want to toggle hold on him so it doesn't get any type of fading effect. Okay. There we go. Okay, so, and not too bad. Alright, so the next thing I'd say we like to do is the rotation, because at least for me, I don't like the arrows remaining up or down the whole time. I like kind of giving them some good direction. I know a lot of people argue that, oh, you know, why is this up arrow or this upvote traveling down or anything like that. To me, the color of the vote or the color of the arrow is what determines what the context of it, and then I like to use the correct rotation so that it looks more appropriate. So I want to do it so where when it's about here, you know, he's got something like this going on, like he's about to throw it. So I'm going to mark this. I'm actually going to kind of work backwards here. So I've turned on keyframing for rotation. Now the way rotation works is this first number is the amount of rotations, the second number is the degrees. You shouldn't have to mess with this amount because this will tick automatically. But as I spin this, you can see now we're at 180, so we're upside down. And once we get it all the way back around to 360, see how it goes to 1, and then we're back to 0. So 1 basically means 360. And so that's if you really want to get something to spin. So if I come down to say 45, and then I go and let's go all the way to the beginning and put like 5, then you can see that thing is going to spin like crazy because it's trying to spin 5 times. So that's what those numbers are for if you need to do some spinning on your arrows. Okay, so let's say about right here. We'll move it down a little bit and we'll even that out. Getting some weird results there, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that. So let's come down a little bit more, bring the rotation. Alright, so yeah, we'll have it start down. Let's see where we're at, 9.2%. That's the problem, is I put this on a bad keyframe. Yeah, so I should be matching these up with my position keyframes because we've already found out that this GIF has a couple frames that skip actual movement. Okay, so let's actually say when he brings it down, he's going to kind of have it forward a little bit. Kind of like that. Okay, so he's got it leaning forward a little bit on him, brings it up, curls it back. In fact, let's do a little bit more, like a real basketball would happen. Okay, and then he throws it. Now when he's throwing it, it's obviously should start spinning, so let's move it up here in this frame, and then when he lets go, it's going to kind of be like that. Now I'm having to do toggle hold a lot here, and that's just because of the nature of this original GIF footage. You don't always have to do that, but just be very aware of it, or else you're going to get weird, like I said, weird movement in between actual movement on the screen. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Yep, alright. So then we got to do the last half of it when it comes down. So right here, and we'll toggle that one. So right here it's on its way down, so let's spin it around that way. And that looks good. Okay, that's good enough. So shoots it, comes down, there we go. Okay, so that looks pretty good for our rotation. And that's actually all we need to do for this upvote portion. We've done the position, rotation, and opacity. Like I said, we can do scale if we wanted to. We can maybe go from 65 down to say 55, but it's such a short distance. I don't even think anybody would notice it at this quality, because remember that at 100%, this is what it looks like. So, you know, it's not very high definition or anything. So, one other thing I do like to do, and I've kind of gotten into a habit of doing this. I don't know if it's good or bad, but if you click on your object, in this case arrow up, and then you hit F3, right? That'll toggle between project and this effect controls. I'm sure you can get there from the view or somewhere, or actually window maybe. If you right click, this is going to be all of the effects that you can apply to this object, and there's a ton of them in here and some really good stuff. In this case, I want to go to blur and sharpen, and I'm going to do a Gaussian blur. Don't ask me what this really does, because I don't know. I just know this one works the best. And I like to leave the blur dimensions on horizontal and vertical, and I like to set the blurriness to a 3. And you can see what that's done here, right? And this little FX here, if I click this on and off, that basically toggles the effect. Because as I add more here, you'll see them show up in here, and so I can toggle them on and off to kind of see what I'm doing. Now the reason I like to do this is because if you look here, it just doesn't look right. This GIF is pretty grainy, it's kind of smooth, it's not very sharp, and my arrow is sharp, and it just doesn't seem to work very well. It just doesn't look like it belongs. But by putting just the 3 on the Gaussian blur, you can see it kind of softens up that arrow. Now you see how when I move sometimes how it got blurry? That's because, like I said, it hasn't rendered out these frames yet. So I'm going to go ahead and let that run through, and it's rendering out. What that's doing is that's applying that blur to that object for every frame. And so once we've let this green line complete, we've got the full render, and now when we watch it, it'll show the appropriate effects on our object. So you can see by just adding that small Gaussian blur, we get a little bit better looking arrow. It just looks a little bit nicer, you know, than using the one that's kind of sharp. This doesn't look like it belongs in here. It's too much of a contrast. So I like to blur that a little bit. Now here's the other great thing too about After Effects is we can do a motion blur on the entire object for the whole length of the composition. And that's what this first box is here. You see it says motion blur. Now I'm going to go ahead and check this off, or just mark it in the icon changes. Now what this means is that this layer has motion blur enabled, but we have to make sure that we actually turn it on for the composition, because if I don't do this, I'm not going to get that motion blur yet. So when I check this off, now what's going to happen is any differences in position, the greater they are, the more motion blur we're going to get. Okay, so you can see right there, I've got a lot of movement going from this frame to here. And I can just turn this off so you can see the difference there. And this is really neat because I think motion blur adds a lot to the upvote GIFs or downvote GIFs. It makes it more realistic of an object moving rather fast. So by turning that on, you can see we get some nice movement there. And you definitely want to experiment. The motion blur for the layer doesn't always work. Sometimes the way you've done some of the framing might not work very well. You can already see that right here. We're getting this weird ghosting effect, and that's just because the amount of movement we've done in our frames, it obviously doesn't like that. So you kind of have to work with these. Like I said, in this case, this GIF might not have been the best example because we're getting a couple of non-moving frames in between here. So in most cases, motion blur will work very well for you. Just don't always use it 100% of the time. You want to make sure it actually looks decent. Another issue too you'll see is that right here you can see I get two arrows because it's trying to simulate the amount of motion blur between the frames. And so if I'm trying to maybe mask portion of this, it's not going to work right, because when I do my masking, I'm going to be cutting off half the arrow here. But now I've got two arrows and one of them is not going to be cut off. So motion blur doesn't work 100% of the time, but I found if you take your time and do the correct movement in your positioning, it can be a very good tool for to your advantage. So I'd say we're done with the upvote arrow. Looks pretty good. Alright, so let's collapse that. Actually, what was it? 65%. Alright, because we want to do the same dimensions for the downvote arrow. So let's go ahead and drag that on here. And we'll call him arrow down. Okay. Alright, so like I said, 65%. So let's go transform him. Scale him down so he's the same. Okay, let's zoom in. Hold spacebar, move over. And so on this frame, remember we hid the opacity because once he hits it, we want the upvote to turn into a downvote. So that means on this frame, we shouldn't see our object. So I'm going to go to this frame and I'm going to put the arrow here. Now what I'm going to do is actually going to be a little confusing because I'm actually going to end up using the motion blurring just because I think it looks good in this case. So remember earlier I said that the position difference matters for your motion blurring, and when I was saying earlier about when the arrow was up off the screen here, you can see right now, see how it's got all that motion blur on it? Now if this previous frame is really close, then when I move this, I'm not going to get a whole lot of motion blur because the difference in position here is very small. So when it tries to move, there's just not much to blur. By putting them really far away, you can see how much it's already blurred there. I mean, the further away I go, there's just a huge difference, and so it's going to make more of a blurring effect. So if you're ever moving something off camera or off out of your composition area, remember that if you're doing this layered motion blur, that it's going to be the position difference that's going to judge how much blurring that you're going to get. So you can even see as I move it, it's trying to adjust that amount of blur. And the reason I bring that up is because for the downvote arrow, we can see when he hits it, there's that ball is already blurring itself. So you can see here it's pretty long. So I don't want the downvote arrow to just appear on the screen, because it's going to look like this. It's going to look pretty flat, and you can see there's already movement going on. So when I put it here on my previous frame, let me enable keyframing. On my previous frame, I'm actually going to throw it up about here. Okay, and then remember I want to bring down the opacity on this frame. Mark my keyframe, and then here, back up to 100%, and there we go. So you can see how I've got this blur going on. If I turn off motion blurring, you can see if I didn't have it, it would just show up an arrow all of a sudden. So let's go ahead and add in the next frame, which looks like about here. So when we do this, it would look kind of weird because that ball has got all that movement on it, and we want to translate that to the arrow. So by putting the starting frame back this far, when we've got the motion blur on, see when he's hitting it, it's already being blurred. Because if I were to have this frame, say, really close when he hits it, it's not going to have the type of motion blur that we were looking for. So that's why I did that. So let's go ahead and add some more frames in here. It looks like it's about right there, and then I think it disappeared after that. So we'll put the last frame down here. once again for the blurring effect. So when it goes off camera, he's blurred in this frame right now. So we'll set the opacity to 0, and remember, we don't want this. We don't want the changing our opacity. So I'm going to come back to the frame where it's 100% and hold or toggle hold on that. That way I get 100% all the way into the frame to where I've switched it to 0. Let's hide all of our stuff here. Okay, so there it goes. Okay, and just to be a perfectionist, I'm actually going to do the rotation, even though you can't even see it. So we'll just set that in that direction there. Okay, so we don't have to use the motion blurring. It would look like this if we didn't, which is alright. Looks a little choppy though, which I don't like. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this on. Let's let it run through one time just to get all the rendering done. Alright, there we go. So he brings it up, throws it, knocks it down. And I think that looks pretty good. Let's not forget to do our standard Gaussian blur. Now this probably doesn't make a damn difference at this point because we're already blurring with the motion, but I'd always do it out of habit. And it's especially nice too if, and I'll do this with some of my higher definition upvote stuff instead of the lower one. This is only 50 by 47, but I like to add, say, and I'll just do this for 1 second, but if I go down stylize, I've got this glow, and you can see how that just looks a little bit nicer there. And the glow looks better too if I turn on my Gaussian blur. You see right now it just doesn't really pop like it does when I've got that blur on. You just get that nice smooth bordering. And so depending on how much glow you add here, you can get some pretty good effects on it. Keep it down at 10. And so now we got that upvote arrow. It just looks a little bit more lively. I think that's a really cool thing. And that's kind of why I like doing the blurs. Some of the other stylizing I'll add, it just looks a little bit nicer when you've already got that blur on there. But we won't worry about other effects at this point. We'll look at those in maybe another video. So I think that looks pretty good. So you can see he changes the direction of it, shoots it, gets knocked down, and there we go. So that's pretty much the basic on modifying a GIF and adding in some objects. We looked at doing position, rotation, opacity, and then the overall scaling, and using the keyframes. Just remember that you click this to enable keyframe mode, not to actually lay down a single keyframe. And as you make changes, as you're moving along here in the time frame, it will auto keyframe for you, so you don't have to worry about laying them down one at a time. So we've got all of our footage, looks pretty good. Now at this point we need to go ahead and render this out. So you should have something down here called render queue. If you don't, then if you go to window, you'll have render queue down here. Now the way After Effects works is that you drop in a composition or a series of compositions and you set your settings, and then it lets you basically do a batch render. In this case we're just rendering one composition. So if we look up here in our project window, we can see we've got our composition, which is Gumby, so I'm going to click and drag him down to here. If we click on this render settings here, we get a bunch of stuff. Now most of this should just be left by default. We don't want to change the frame rate because we already like how it looks. We can change some other stuff. The only important thing in here is if we're using motion blur, which we are, this setting right here, we've got on and off for all layers. Now if I turn this off, it won't render the motion blur. So you got to make sure you have this on, and this is on for checked layers. And what that was, remember, was that's this first checkbox column here is the motion blur. Okay, this just enables the motion blur for when I'm working in the editing frame here. If I don't have these on and I have this on, it's not going to render any motion blur. In fact, if I have this off and I have these on, it will still render the motion blur because that setting is applying to it as a checked layer. The other thing that's useful in here is you've got, if you go to custom, you've got your time span, which is your starting and ending, and then it's going to show what the duration is. In most cases you're not going to modify this because you would have trimmed your video, but perhaps you want to render out a small portion of your GIF or whatever, you can go ahead and do that in here. So we're not going to change anything there. We are going to go to output module, click on lossless and change our format to PNG, and we're going to go ahead and leave all the sizing. Output 2, it's going to my frames folder, and we'll render. Now at this point, you could reference my old video or my previous video that I did that showed how to output well-made GIFs. I'm not going to go over all that again, but basically, we output it to our frames, then we run our makeGif.batch. You can see I was doing something else before, and we get our output, and then we choose if we want to do Imager or minus.com. But like I said, I covered all that in my previous video, so I think that is pretty good for doing a upvote downvote GIF. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you.